joining us on Facebook, and also we've just started recording. So welcome to those listening to the recording again. This is the Happiness and Social Change free webinar with Alex Nunn from Action for Happiness. Sorry to the people from Zoom that get a double interruption, but it means that you can watch the recording later and listen back to all of our all of the wisdom shared. I'm just going to do a bit more of a detailed introduction now, just so that you guys have a bit of a sense of who you're chatting with as well, because we've heard a little bit about some of the amazing people joining us on the Zoom. So I'm Flo Shalom from the Network of Wellbeing, which is a UK-based network that builds connections between people and organisations that are kind of actively, passionately working on wellbeing for people and planet. Alex Nunn is joining me this evening, and he is working for Action for Happiness, which is a social movement that encourages people to put happiness into action, and they do some amazing work, and it's really inspiring to watch Alex's work. And also as well as that, we've become good friends through work, but also because we're both members of a mindfulness group that's called Wake Up, and this mindfulness group is kind of inspired by the work of Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist mindfulness teacher. And so it's been brilliant to share a lot of discussions with Alex about this topic, actually, and I'm really happy that he agreed to join us this evening to talk about this in more detail. So thanks again to everyone joining us. What Alex and I discussed is that it might be nice just to fully arrive together in the space with a minute or so of mindfulness, and just so that we can be really present for this this discussion that we're going to have together. So I will hand over to Alex to guide that for us. And welcome, Alex. I realise I've been speaking a lot.
Oh, well, it's lovely to be here, Flo. And I think I just want to start very briefly with just a little bit of gratitude to you for nudging me into doing this. It feels like a real honor and a privilege to be sitting here and watching the names of people coming in and the different locations that people are coming in from, and thinking about the intentions that people are bringing into it and the questions, and this opportunity we have to be together and explore what for me feels like a really important and relevant subject. But we're going to start by arriving, so I'll take up that invitation. So I'm aware that there may be a mixture of familiarities with mindfulness as a discipline amongst the community of people currently listening in. But given that we just have a very brief period of time, just a minute or so, we can think of it just as arriving here together. And the way that we can do that is just by coming back to this experience of being embodied as ourselves. So for me, what that currently feels like is the feeling of my legs on the floor that I'm sitting on, and the pressure and the contact there. I'm aware of the feeling of the straightness of my back. I'm noticing a sense of comfort in many of the muscles of my body and some tension in other areas. And being here in this body, in this moment, I'm also aware of the movement of the breath. That movement that is always happening in the present moment, whether coming in or going out. And this experience of the breath, wherever you feel it, maybe in the rising and the falling of your abdomen, maybe in the expanding and contracting of your chest, or that faint rushing feeling at the tips of your nostrils. You can just gently bring attention to that. Noticing the breath coming in. Noticing the breath coming out. And it's not a test. There's no judgment. We do this with a sense of ease. Just gently bringing the mind to the breath. Bringing the mind to the body. Letting ourselves be here. Okay, mindfulness.
Thank you so much, Alex. That's a really lovely way to start the discussion, I think, because yeah, I certainly feel a lot more grounded and present, actually. And I hope that you guys do too. And actually, we went live on Facebook a little bit later than I thought. So now people are watching us on Facebook, so welcome. And yeah, I think to start off with, we're actually gonna go from mindfulness, and like Alex said, I know that the audience will probably have different experiences with mindfulness, and we can pick up on that more in the questions and answers later, if that's helpful or of interest for people to go more deeply in. But just I'm going to ask Alex a few questions, and then we'll do a short practical exercise, and then you guys will have the chance to ask as many questions as you like later. And so the first question that I wanted to ask you, Alex, just to kind of open up the discussion, was obviously this webinar is based on the connection between happiness and social change, and exploring both of those topics. And I wanted to ask, why is this this area of such interest to you? Why does it speak to you, and maybe the work that you're doing?
Yeah. And also, who am I to be sitting here? Also, yeah. Thank you, Flo. It's yeah. As I was mentioning a little bit before, it's a real privilege to be sitting here and to be exploring this subject. You know, why is it relevant to me? I'm kind of assuming that if anyone's joined this call, it's also relevant to you too, and I'm hoping for similar reasons, because when we look inside of ourselves and experience our lives, it's clear that emotions and happiness are very important. And when we look out at the world and the state of the world, it's clear that it's not constructed in a way that is particularly attuned to producing that. There's a lot in the world that's really quite messed up. And the function of bringing these together is really, really important. Relates a lot to the work that I do in my role at Action for Happiness, which I'm sure I can expand on as we go through. But I think it's helpful just to start with kind of how I got here, because I kind of started off my working life in the music industry, kind of came straight out of a sort of training course in electric guitar, which is not the conventional route into society. But yeah, I was in Brighton. I was drinking a lot. I was going to see bands. Life was kind of about parties and about kind of identifying myself as a musician and trying to get people to respect me as such. But as I look back on it, I'm aware of a kind of overarching sense of kind of emptiness within that wasn't producing satisfaction. It wasn't really producing happiness for me. And where I started to get a sense of where meaning could come from in life, and how I could kind of start to experience the world and myself as kind of valuable, was when I went to take an opportunity to go and work in Ukraine on a project focused on, well, democratic development, and kind of engaging young people in grassroots politics, which gave me this understanding that actually you can work for the good of others. And that actually I realized that a lot of the things I was doing, including kind of drinking and wanting to be seen and wanting to be loved, and all these things that were coming out in my habits and my personality, were, you know, largely based as a way of me trying to reject the fact that I found the world quite difficult to comprehend, and found myself kind of avoiding and running away from. And what practically working on a project for social good gave me was the opportunity to go to face that situation, to face the world. And it taught me, what skills I have and what I can apply to it. And I think actually on my first day at Action for Happiness, I heard my colleague and boss and friend, Mark Williamson, say, as part of a sort of training he was delivering, that satisfaction in work is about knowing who you are and what you're good at and applying that to things you care about. Well, I found what I cared about, and I was starting to find ways of applying kind of who I was to that. And I through that, discovered that I wanted to kind of be involved in campaigning, and kind of took the traditional kind of route of interning in various kind of campaigning organizations back here in the UK with quite a lot of enthusiasm, but quite quickly found that actually it wasn't totally what I was looking for. Although there was that focus on working for others, on changing things, actually the work that I was getting involved in often was operating within a very limited kind of emotional spectrum. It was either about kind of making people afraid of the horrors of what might be going on, or getting people enraged, which of course is very motivating, but doesn't really go very far in terms of creating solutions or convincing people who are of the opposite view. So it was kind of limited in its effect, and it's also very difficult to emotionally sustain. It's hard work to be angry or to be shocked and in horror over a consistent period of time without getting hugely burnt out, which I'm sure many people will encounter if they do go into that sort of social change work. So that seemed like not quite the perfect fit for me, and I started to explore what other organizations were out there and other initiatives were out there doing something positive and taking a fresh approach, which might have an opportunity to really make a difference, but also might feel like a good fit for me and what I wanted to kind of bring to things. And that's how I kind of found Action for Happiness, this movement for a happier and more caring society that encompasses both the personal change of the fact that happiness is something we do have the opportunity to impact within ourselves, but also has this vision of a happier and more caring society for everybody, and encourages these actions, which are of course largely altruistic in their nature, and bringing happiness to others as a way of kind of both topping up our own happiness but contributing to this bigger vision also. So that kind of explains how I got to Action for Happiness, but why I'm still here 5 years later is because of my really strong belief of the connection between happiness and social change. And it's through this kind of gateway of personal change. It's the opportunity that happiness provides to be a vehicle for personal change that I think has great relevance to looking at society from a kind of systems perspective and looking at how we can affect nodes within that network, which I'm sure we'll dive into a little bit more deeply. But yeah, so that was quite a lot flowed out there.
Yeah, but that's really,
thanks.
Thank you for sharing so much, because I think that a lot of points of your story will resonate with a lot of people, and like you've said, I think we're all here because we find this such an important topic, and that we find both happiness and social change in these times so relevant. And actually some of the points you touched on, I'm sure definitely resonate with me, in terms of at first kind of being in a feeling of avoidance, but then having that sense of emptiness and realizing that there are wider challenges going on but not knowing how to contribute. And then what you share about finding a way to contribute, but that being within a kind of very narrow, somewhat limiting or narrow framework in terms of what it required of you in terms of emotions, and not being able to see any kind of solutions focus. And I see Femke in the comments as well as saying, thank you for sharing. I can relate to your experiences with campaigning and narrow emotional frequency band. So yeah, I think that it's a challenge that a lot of people face, that you don't want to you don't want to ignore the pressing issues facing us, but you also aren't any use massively burning yourself out and becoming so angry and frustrated by everything. So it's kind of looking at how do we find a balance in between those tensions, those pressures on us. And in a way that leads us to the next question. So a few of the questions we shared on the Facebook event beforehand, and one of the most popular ones was and it's something we've touched on already, but the connection, what is the connection between happiness and social change? So what justifies kind of putting those two topics together, which isn't necessarily an intuitive thing to do. So I wonder if you could speak to that question a bit, Alex.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Flo. So I'm aware that listening into this call, it's a very broad range of people, I'm sure. But I'm aware of two particular kind of motivations that might be present in why someone might join a conversation on this topic about kind of happiness and social change. You might be someone who's perhaps interested in personal development and well-being and has kind of gone that route and maybe had quite a lot of success and development in cultivating that internal change, but is interested in how you can kind of bring that into the world and the relevance of that in the world. So that's one way of looking at this question. The other is that you might be a social change agent who is, maybe has spotted some of the similar things that I experienced when I spent a brief time exploring a small part of kind of campaigning here in the UK. Who's interested in what you can kind of gain from the topic of happiness in order to continue affecting the change that you're already working on. So I'll try to say something that's relevant to both, but I just wanted to acknowledge that both might be present in this. So yeah, I guess, yeah, very briefly, the kind of in theory, if we're asking about what is the connection between happiness and social change, we're also looking at a kind of deeper question, a more fundamental question. What is the relevance of feelings in society? Well, I would hope that fairly intuitively and clearly they play quite a big role. They govern how we as individuals are kind of motivated. They function in the forms of our desires. They affect our behavior, which might include things from who we vote for to whether or not we're willing to join colleagues of ours on a strike. Feelings are going to play a big role in the way that we operate in society and the decisions that are made both individually and also collectively. So if we look at society as this kind of mass of connections of individuals who are collaborating in various ways and trying to find ways to sort of measure and control and check and balance upon one another's behavior, but in a way that somehow kind of democratically functions towards a collective whole, or we might look, I would hope we could say collective well-being might be the aim of that, but others might disagree. The reason why it's kind of like, why happiness? Okay, if okay, feelings are important in society, but why is happiness so valuable, and why is happiness something that I think is worth championing? And I think probably the best example really comes from the work that we do at Action for Happiness. I hope it's clear that I'm someone who cares about the state of the world and feels that there's a lot that should change, and yet I'm choosing to invest my time in an organization that primarily is promoting happiness. The reason for that is because of the effect that I've seen happiness have on people, and more specifically, not just happiness, but this invitation to think more deeply about what happiness really is and where it really comes from, and the change that produces in individuals is really profound. So yeah, a few of the kind of 3 headline changes that take place in people when they come on an Action for Happiness course, or when they interact with some of our materials, or participate in an event. They can become, by tuning into this question of like what really matters, and how is happiness really operating in my life, they can become aware of kind of the false happiness. It becomes quite clear that actually a lot of the behaviors, things I was mentioning in my sort of teenage life, actually don't produce a lot of happiness. They're actually often avoidance strategies that are helping to sort of numb our feelings rather than actually producing significant positive ones. And we can look at the desire for sort of fame and wealth and how those are sort of promoted in society. I don't think we've really got time to do a sort of full critique of sort of consumerism and advertising culture and how that's had an effect on society over so many years. But people become much more aware of that. And once you're aware of it, you can start to operate in relation to it a lot more intelligently. You can start to be selective about what you expose yourself to. You can start to make better decisions. The second thing people become really aware of when they start to look into their own happiness is the importance of their relationships with others. That actually time and again, people who who stop and really think about their happiness, they suddenly understand that, family or friends or the actual people who they're working with every day in their team are so much more important than the objectives they might have as a team to fulfill, and that those relationships become something that's actually very sacred to us when we start to care about our happiness. That's quite important. The last thing is that I find practical ways of taking action that actually, positive psychology and the great advances in our understanding of happiness have brought out lots of creative tools, for example, gratitude exercises and various other things that, we've got a whole technology, if you're interested in looking into this, in Action for Happiness, of the 10 keys to happier living. The point is that they're very practical, simple things. And when we start to take simple, immediate action, we not only kind of embed the idea for ourselves in a much more tangible way, because we've then experienced something working rather than hearing that it works. We're also starting to build our own sense of agency. And that's really important when we're looking at tackling a big problem like, say, climate change or whatever else it might be. Our personal sense of agency, how much we feel like we're capable of making a difference, really is going to have an impact on how much we are able to commit ourselves to making a difference. So that's the sort of broad view of happiness and why it matters in this kind of social change context. But I'd like to I was mentioning, I realize I've been speaking for some time, Flo, but I will just because it felt important. I even put a star by it saying important when was it Shemaiah? Yeah, when Shemaiah. Shemaiah, I've just seen you said, would you recap those 3 points again? So since I've seen that, and I was about to speak to you anyway, I will do that. So when we look into happiness, we become aware of the things that are blocking our happiness and the kind of false happiness that we might be pursuing in, for example, consuming. The second is that we become more aware of our connections with other people. And the third is that we can start to find practical ways to take action that start to build agency. But I want to come to this idea of because you might already be a social change agent, right? This is kind of a generic thing for people in general, but if you're someone who's already kind of working on the front lines, maybe you're working in Greece, working with the refugees who are washing up on the beaches day after day, maybe you're, someone who's tying yourselves to trees in the Amazon to stop deforestation. How can we convincingly say that happiness is sort of relevant to someone in those positions in a way that doesn't sound kind of infantilizing and kind of petty? And I think there's quite a lot of evidence behind it. There's that actually when we start to become more aware of happiness and skillful in our means of navigating happiness, various other things can emerge within us. We've already sort of mentioned about compassion. I think that would already be present in a social change agent type person, but also our hopefulness, our resilience, our creativity, our sense of being kind of optimistic in relation to challenges that might emerge, our ability to think of new solutions to problems and come up with fresh ways of dealing with things rather than repeating patterns that may have already kind of stalled, and also our ability to transcend conflict when we're coming from a positive emotional place, which there's a lot of evidence to show that actually when you approach a dialogue with somebody else, if you're approaching that from a position of conflict, you're likely to bring up their barriers, and you've got to work much harder to climb over those barriers to get any kind of message through, to get them to even consider a different way of operating. Whereas if you're approaching them from a much more kind of non-violent perspective and without that judgment, because you've managed to take control of your own emotional state, you're actually much more likely to be able to communicate with someone in a way that actually gets that idea across. So this can kind of be summed up as this idea of kind of intelligent emotionality. I'm not saying you just need happiness and then you get social change. It's that happiness can be a route to understanding and using all of our emotions much more effectively, whether that's anger going from being something that's very destructive and burning us out to being something that causes us to be very determined and focused, or in my own case, I used to be very kind of cynical, and actually that was very deconstructive. I used to kind of pull things apart and find lots of reasons, ask lots of questions why, and find lots of answers for why not to do things. But with the introduction, partly through kind of mindfulness practice, of some humility and the cultivation of compassionate intent, that cynicism has now become much more of like a kind of discerning wisdom, the ability to kind of tell things for what they really are and be able to spot the good in things and bring those out. So yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alex. That was a really helpful look at different perspectives on the connection between happiness and social change. And I think when we were talking about it before, you kind of succinctly summed it up, as you can see, like happiness as social change. So like, you know, cultivating a genuine sense of happiness in ourselves can be a form of social change, because like you've gone through, it can kind of challenge the more materialist, consumerist version of happiness that we're sold in various ways in the current structures of society, and can kind of cultivate a more genuine sense of what happiness is through relationships, through meaningful work, through all of these things. So that's kind of happiness as social change. But then happiness for social change being that, you know, those that are already kind of working on the front lines of the many important social change causes of today also need nourishment and support in themselves. So that kind of, yeah, that being able to generate that optimism and that hope for the future, like you say. So I just wanted to share, because I thought that was a really helpful way to kind of summarize some of the really helpful points you shared. I'm really aware that I'm keen to bring other people's voices in and to give us time for questions at the end. I think that what we'll do, we had one more question that we were going to discuss, but I think we might bring that in more at the end in the questions, and then move on more to the practical exercise, so that we can start to look at embodying some of this, some of the things we're talking about, and also then so that we have enough time to bring in your guys' voices. Because I noticed, just to say on that point, I noticed that I think Frank, and lovely that you're here, Frank, has put a question in the chat box. So if people have questions, if you can put them in the Q&A box at the bottom, then when we get to the Q&A section at the end, after the practical exercise, we'll just run through those, all the questions that people have. Maybe I'll just, yeah, Shamaya said nice summaries, thank you. So thank you for summarising the 3 points, Alex. And Caroline said turning negative emotions that we as fragile humans all experience and finding positive, useful directions for them is such a useful and interesting subject. I think that's beautifully said, actually, Caroline, because we all are fragile and vulnerable, actually. And I see that vulnerability as a real strength. Once we can connect with ourselves, then we can more genuinely connect with each other and have a more, you know, a deeper sense of compassion for others in the wider world as well. So thank you for your comment. If anyone else has comments, feel free to type in the chat box, or also people watching on Facebook, my colleague Morella is keeping an eye on comments and questions there to feed into the Zoom as well. So Alex, have you got any kind of reflections, or are you happy to move on to the practical exercise at this stage?
Yeah, I really liked Caroline's introduction, that you reflected back on this idea of fragility, and it reminds me of, I often find myself coming back to this idea from Brené Brown of the fact that we can't selectively numb emotions, and that actually, you know, as we begin to kind of deepen our connection with any particular kind of aspect of our emotional life, those other elements are going to come out too. But we can either face those, we can either kind of run away from those, or we can find ways to start using them skillfully, which can benefit not just us, but also how we operate in society as well. So lovely, and thanks, Flo.
Yeah, brilliant. Okay, well, like I say, we love to have kind of a practical aspect of these webinars, and when I say practical, it just means that a sense of some kind of exercise to help reflect on how we can integrate some of the things we're talking to into our lives. So that's just going to be very short, 5 minutes or so of an exercise before we go into, and maybe some reflections from you guys before we go into answering some of your questions. So I will hand over to Alex to lead that.
Cool. 5 minutes, change the world, go.
No pressure, no pressure.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm gonna just introduce what my thinking was in doing this. So when I originally kind of thought through what would be a really useful exercise in thinking, I really wanted to bring together this kind of big picture element of social change with the kind of small immediate aspect of our own senses and feelings. And I came up with this quite kind of enthusiastic exercise of kind of meeting some kind of thing we want to change in the world, and then envisaging a positive alternative and cultivating that sense of vision and hope, and really embodying being in that space and using our imaginative capacities to draw that vision closer and closer, and then finding a small kind of practical way to kind of move towards that in the realities of our lives. But actually, when I tried it out with my colleagues, there was an immediate sense already in the space that actually there's a step before that that we needed, and that I think many on this call might need, which is just already just healing. Actually, before we're ready to get into a space where we're thinking of creative solutions, we need to be able to kind of cultivate a sense of gratitude and sufficient to be able to meet our kind of grief for the problems of the world, and be able to do that wholeheartedly. So I think in the 4 minutes now that we have, we can just use mindfulness as a way of kind of drawing out positive qualities and values that exists in ourselves that we'd like to see more of in the world. Flo, I really liked when you used the phrase nourishing and supporting, and I think that could be a really good theme for us to work with. So for those of you familiar with a mindfulness practice, maybe you'd like to make yourselves comfortable in some way. You can have your eyes open or closed, but just allowing yourself to settle. And as will be familiar for those who were here at the beginning of this call, we're going to start just with mindfulness of the body and the breath, and allowing ourselves to be here right now with whatever this conversation has brought up for us, with whatever is present in the body and the mind, just being here. And for me, I notice a sense of groundedness in how I'm sitting, a sense of stability on the earth, supported. And if you find your mind is jumping around like a monkey from branch to branch, you can just tempt it back to the soothing flow of the breath. Coming in, going out. Happening thousands of times a day throughout our lives. Sustaining everything we've ever done, everything we've ever thought, everything we are. We owe to the fact that we are breathing. So whatever is present for you, whatever thoughts are in the mind, whatever feelings are in the body, just allowing yourself to feel some gratitude for that experience of the breath. Noticing how the in-breath fills, expands, gives potential. Noticing how the out-breath drops, soothes, eases. So that whatever is going on in our minds, whatever challenges we are meeting in the world and in our experience, alongside us we have the breath, filling us with life, offering us ease. And as we move now into the last stage of this exercise, we can allow our minds to move to the fact of going forth, to going on from this call, on from this webinar, on from this moment and into the world. And if you can, and if you like, thinking of one small, simple, easy way that you can take action from this space of gratitude and ease. How can you take these qualities you find within yourself into action in the world? It doesn't have to be anything big, grand and significant. It can be very simple. And if you're reaching around and find that something doesn't come, that's okay. Already cultivating the aspiration will make you much more open to the opportunities that present themselves. Meaning we're much more likely to bring these values into the world. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Alex. That was very beautiful. Just inviting those that are still with us on Zoom or watching on Facebook, if you would like to share any reflections on that exercise, or if you feel inspired to do so, you could also share your small action in the chat, but do not feel any pressure to do so. I found that like really valuable myself, Alex. Thank you so much for leading it, because actually a week or two ago I went on I told you about this, a mindfulness and social change course at the ULEX Centre in Spain. Actually a few of my of the lovely people that were on that course are on this webinar today, so hello to all. And what that was one of the kind of lessons learned from that was the importance of kind of cultivating a mindfulness and that sense of presence in yourself in order to give you more tools to be able to put into practice some of the things we've been talking about, a more compassionate approach. And I think just doing that practice with you now, like kind of really took me back and reminded me of that. And so my small action is just to begin again, because I've stopped for about a week, my daily mindfulness practice. You've inspired me. So I will just check in, and just to remind you guys, we will have about 10 minutes or so of questions now, and I'm going to run through the Q&A box that's at the bottom. So if you have had questions as we've been going through and you've typed them in the chat box of Zoom, please just pop them in the Q&A box, just so that it makes it easier for us to see what the questions have been. And if people have questions on Facebook, then type them, and my colleague Morella is going to help with putting them into Zoom. And also, just to let you know, because I know this feeling of I get it a lot, are we going to have time to answer all the questions, can come up with this part of the discussion. But Alex and I talked about that before, and we agreed that any questions that we weren't able to answer, because obviously this is a huge topic and a discussion that will be hopefully ongoing. So we can take some of the questions that aren't answered and kind of reflect on them in a future blog post, and yeah, find ways to keep the discussion going as well. But we'll answer as many questions as possible. But before we go to that, I'll just scan through and see if anyone wanted to share anything about from the meditation. So Caroline's saying setting good examples helps, starting small, realistic. I think there is a lot of I think there's a lot of rhetoric out there. I know I talk more than I do. Yeah, I think that's a real challenge that a lot of people find about this balance between knowing what you want to do and actually doing it. But that's why I really welcome your invitation, Alex, not to be too hard on ourselves and to find small actions. And I think that there's a real power in them building from there.
Yeah, agency really snowballs. So if
Yeah.
you can find the kind of insight of picking something small is that you're much more likely to do it, and that once you've done it, you're then much more likely to be able to make whatever that next step might be.
Exactly. And Frank says, yes, walking the talk is much more convincing than further talk. Indeed, Frank. And Anita says she was interrupted. She'd love to try the meditation again later if it will be available, which it will on the recording, Anita. And I'll mark out where the meditation is specifically in the recording when we share it, so that you, if you want to go straight directly back to Alex's lovely voice. I'm going to go to some of the questions now. Let's just see. An anonymous attendee has asked how to find an in and out balance in search of happiness. Should we dive in first or at the same time? I think this is kind of like, the inner and the outer, and how do you balance between the two, basically, is the question from anonymous attendee.
Yeah, wow. That is kind of the ultimate question when it comes to, it certainly feels that way for me. And it's not one for which there's a set answer. It's one of these slightly sort of false dichotomies between, like, is happiness about your external circumstances, or is it about your internal attitude? And of course it's about both. And the journey really is about allowing yourself to have the awareness and the flexibility to kind of bend in both directions, and the attunement to know how that's feeling, to be able to kind of go, okay, this is too much. So, we sometimes talk in Action for Happiness about kind of seekers and spreaders, people who are either kind of seeking happiness or people who are looking to spread to others. But there are kind of other categories around that as well, with well, one that feels very personal to me. I happen to be someone who is connected to a lot of people in life that I would consider sort of savers. They're people who are very attuned to and care about the well-being of others, but actually lack skills and resources around their own well-being. And so often for those people, actually what's most powerful would be to learn some self-compassion, to learn how to support and nourish themselves, would actually be to become a little bit more selfish in some ways, might actually benefit them such that they're unable to give so much more in the way that they naturally do. So it's actually a sort of rebalancing back towards the center between self and other that enables them to move forward. So I'm afraid, for the sake of the person who asked the question, it would be a case of allowing yourself to accept that this is something that is fluid, and that it's the very awareness of the fact that you're asking the question means that you're asking the right question, and you're looking out to your circumstances. I'd also be aware, I'm someone who is starting to become more aware of the ways in which I blame my external circumstances for things that I feel internally, but also aware of the way that I actually can self-blame for things that are actually coming from outside of me. So I'm afraid I'm not doing very much more than identifying the two poles here, but hopefully having an awareness of them will make us more able to navigate this kind of fluid dynamic in life.
Yeah, thank you, Alex. That's really helpful. And I think, like you say, it's one of those questions that is the answer is in the balance, and it's a constant process. It's not one or the other. And Caroline has asked, with so many things that feel like they matter, how do we choose where to focus our positive energy? Another very important question.
Yeah, really interesting question. I'm on the edge of diving into a conversation about the nature of choice and free will and where that comes from, but I'm going to put that to one side and say that personally I find trusting intuition to be very powerful. That actually often our anxieties about what to do and how to make decisions come from our kind of rational mind trying to deconstruct situations and evaluate them and pros and cons, and things just don't match up very well because they're artificial models we're creating around them anyway. But our subconscious mind, which has the benefit of everything we've ever seen, everything we've ever heard, it's picking up the full periphery of everything. When you think you're focusing on the computer screen, your eyes are picking up so many more things around you. All of that is going into your mind. So your subconscious mind is actually, which powers your intuition, has got a vast resource in terms of what it's processing with. So being able to stop and trust our intuition about what feels like the most important thing right now. Is it to go and help your elderly neighbor down the road and check they've got enough shopping, or is it to sign up to Greenpeace and save the polar bears, or be out on the barricades somewhere in the world? Only you can answer that question, but you can't answer it, I would suggest, by deconstructing it with your mind. You have to kind of trust into your felt experience and let yourself be drawn, because what you find yourself drawn to in those circumstances is not just what matters most, it's also where you as an individual are needed most, with your individual skills and strengths and ability and everything you bring. So yeah, that's what I've tended to find anyway.
Yeah, it reminds me of, I can't remember where the quote comes from, but there's a quote that if you're wondering what to do to help the world, find what makes you feel most alive and do that, because what the world needs is more people that are alive. So I think that in a way is another way of saying what you've said so well there, Alex, that listening to your heart. It feels hard and almost vulnerable to say it in that way, because out of fear of sounding a bit too over the top or cheesy, but I think that there is a sense of that we need to have, that is quite courageous to be able to listen to our hearts.
There's one other thing I think I want to bring into it though, because a tendency that I know I have is to find something my heart is telling me, and then my mind latches onto it and grips it really tightly, and then it won't let go. And what the heart is telling you is relevant is only what is relevant for right now, and you need to stay open. Because otherwise you might find yourself getting caught on one particular view or kind of attitude or impulse that was relevant at the time but is no longer helpful. So yeah, balance it out.
Yeah, thank you. And Heinz has asked, if I work towards my own personal happiness as a social being, isn't that social change already if I succeed? So I think in a way that this is something that you touched on earlier, and I think that the answer is yes.
Yeah, if you're looking into happiness in a really genuine and authentic way, if you're not blocking out the other emotions that come when you start to look into that, and if you're recognizing yourself honestly as an authentically connected human being that is part of a much greater whole, I think you'll naturally be drawn into being a more positive and contributing member of society.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Heinz, for the question. And I think I see that there's quite a few questions left, and I am aware of the time. So I'm going to ask you, Alex, one more question. And then some of my Network of Wellbeing colleagues, Josh and Roger, are listening in, and they kindly agreed to copy these questions down so that we can look through them and answer some of them in a kind of follow-up, like I say, hopefully a blog post, or I'll email all of you guys that have registered, tell you how we're going to follow up with that specifically. So I'm just mentioning that as a little reminder to Josh and Roger to kindly copy down all of the remaining questions. And I think that the last question, and thank you so much to those that have asked questions on on Facebook as well. But I think the last question I'm going to ask, Alex, is one that I think will be really relevant to a lot of activists as well, is from T, that anger can be the go-to emotion for a lot of activists. And is it possible without judgment to encourage more happiness in our friends and colleagues, and is it our place? So I guess it's just interesting, I think, that invitation from T just to kind of reflect on the role of anger and and how we engage with others if we've got a real kind of passion for social change.
Wow, yeah. I can see why you picked this question. So this is one part about the role of anger and how we can use that skillfully, and one part about what right do we have to be affecting change in others. I think for me, the best view on anger that helps is this constructive or is this deconstructive? Is what I'm feeling motivated to do here about destroying something I feel is bad, or is it about building or protecting something I feel is good? And if you're coming from that place of building or protecting, you're much more likely to be able to be interacting with people, even though you may be in the sort of determined state of importance that's driven by that emotion of anger. You're much more likely to be doing that in a way that is genuinely wholesome and helpful to the situation. In terms of how we can support others, there's that phrase that the world is changed by your example and not your opinion. And I think there's some real wisdom to that. I think the more that people around you see you embodying the values that you really care about, and see that that is producing both happiness and well-being for you, and also is mobilizing you to really do some good in the world, the more likely they are to go through that same process for themselves. They might not come to the exact same answers you have, but the fact that you have gone through that process yourself will inspire them to ask the questions, and that's often enough.
Yeah. Wow, thank you so much, Alex. Yeah, thank you so much for all of your answers. It's been, for me, this is a topic that we talk about a lot anyway, and it's great to have the chance to go into more depth and to have so many amazing people joining us and sharing their insights and experiences and questions. And like I say, sorry due to time that we don't have the chance to go through everyone's questions, but I will copy them down, and yeah, we'll address them afterwards. And for now, to kind of close, I just wanted to share a few short things and offer a space for Alex to share anything in terms of kind of ways that you can stay connected with Alex and Action for Happiness, and if you're interested in going deeper into this topic. So yeah, Alex, maybe I'll give to you first in case there are things, and then I'll say a few things.
Yeah. One of the things that we do, one of the things we realize with Action for Happiness is that sometimes it really helps to have a roadmap. It helps to have something really tangible you can do. And for the last 3 years or so, I've been working on running a program called Exploring What Matters, which is a community-based, volunteer-run 8-week course that invites people to have the opportunity to kind of have, conversations at the level that we've just been having today about stuff that really matters, but also to have the opportunity to tune in to their own experience with mindfulness and gratitude, to connect with other people who have a similar vision of the world, and also to find practical ways of taking action. So if you'd like to find out more about that, you can go online. Maybe we can drop the link in somewhere for people to click, Flo, but the link, if people are typing it in from what I'm saying, is www.actionforhappiness.org/course, and you can find out more about that and how to volunteer there. Flo, are you going to say a bit about the Radical Wellbeing retreat?
Yeah. I was so like we've mentioned, Alex and I are good friends, and we often have these kind of chats, and yeah, we wanted an opportunity to go a bit more deeply into this topic and really explore it. And so later this year in November, we're going to run a weekend long kind of retreat of sorts, where called Radical Wellbeing, Mindful Living for a Better World. Our working title. And it's in a small centre in Devon. It's for about kind of 18 people. We haven't started advertising it publicly yet, but we just wanted to share with you guys as the people that are clearly passionate about this topic. And if you are interested in staying in the loop about that, just I will send an email, a follow-up email to all of the people that have attended, you know, in the next day or two, and just reply to me and say I'd be interested in staying in the loop, and then Alex and I can, as soon as there's a registration page open, we'll send it to you guys first, sort of thing. So that's just an invitation, and to, yeah, because we were aware that within an hour's webinar we can only really scratch the surface of this topic. So yeah, we'll send you some further details. For those watching on Facebook or the recording, you can get in touch with the with myself via the Network of Wellbeing, and I can send you the information that way. And yeah, and just to let you all know, the Network of Wellbeing runs monthly webinars about different aspects of wellbeing. So as you can tell from this discussion, we're not seeing wellbeing as only a personal thing, but also very much about how we connect to our communities and how we connect to the wider world, how we connect to society, to nature, as well as to each other. So next month, we're going to have the Network of Wellbeing Director, Roger Higman, as a kind of guest. And then the month after, we're going to have the Carnegie UK Trust talking about kindness as a kind of avenue to creating community change, and they've done a lot of interesting research on that. So we will share, again, I'll share this in the follow-up email, but just to give you guys an impression of some of the ways you can stay involved. But for now, I will say thank you so much again to Alex for your time and your inspiring answers, and yeah, and thank you so much to everyone that's joined the discussion. I've found it really brilliant to have so many amazing people here, and your positive comments coming in. Yeah, and I will now copy down the questions, because I'll copy down the questions, like I say. And yeah, I think that's everything, in case you wanted to add anything else, Alex.
Yeah, I just want to say huge gratitude to you, Flo, and to the Network of Wellbeing for hosting this. And yeah, just some appreciation. How wonderful is this, that a conversation that you and I have been having and feel so passionate about, we can open up to so many other people. And I'm really hopeful that we can find more avenues to get other people's voices even more involved in this really important topic. So thank you all for your time in sitting and being with us. What a joy. Thank you.